For me right now, the most irreconcilable clash is between my understanding of the nature of reality and my experience or my feelings and beliefs relates to the concept of free will and the process of decision making. So we speak a lot here and we think a lot about decisions, usually major life decisions. And they're complicated, but I can't even figure out like what's going on when I decide to move my finger up and down. On the one hand, it seems incredibly obvious, but when I look at it, the mechanics of a specific choice, it's much more complicated than that because, first of all, there's no personal self. There's no separate self that's performing that action. You know, even in the materialist model, you know, the new neuroimaging suggests that neuroactivity begins maybe on average 1 to 2 seconds prior to conscious intention. And years ago, in the process of deeper meditation, which I no longer do, but I could actually see the intentional thoughts, that intention sort of arise out of nothingness. And then I would find myself just standing up or finishing the meditation, and I could actually visualize or see that process. So, but we can't help believing and feeling that we live in a world where we have choice and moral responsibility, but it's free will. It seems impossible. So then we can say, well, it's consciousness, of course. It's consciousness that's performing that action, but consciousness has no volition, as you've said. As Krishnamurti said, it's choiceless awareness.
Yes, but
I understand the feeling, which you've said in the past, that feeling of freedom that we cherish and love is based on infinite consciousness is infinite potential and unlimited freedom. So I understand the feeling, but in terms of the specific mechanics of a decision, it always feels as if, as I watch and experiment with it, with moving the finger or my arm, that the action happens, and then it's like you've said, it's like the clown that takes the bow at the end of a performance. That separate self, that false sense of separation, takes credit for something that it didn't do. So I've been going around in circles with this, and I was hoping you could help me.
Yes, Krishnamurti was right. Awareness itself is choiceless and without preference. But when that choiceless awareness is filtered through the prism of the finite mind, it refracts its indivisibility into a multiplicity and diversity of objects. And at that level, there are preferences and choices. So it is choiceless awareness that refracts itself through the activity of each of our minds and makes choices about objects. Just as John Smith is, within the limits of the metaphor, choiceless. He really doesn't mind what happens to King Lear's relationship with his daughters. But so John Smith is choiceless. All there is to King Lear's mind is John Smith's mind. Does that mean that because John Smith is choiceless, therefore King Lear is choiceless? After all there is to King Lear is John Smith? No. King Lear does make decisions. He does have preferences. He does make choices, although all there is to King Lear is choiceless John Smith. It's the same. All there is to each of our minds is choiceless awareness. But when that choiceless awareness limits and localizes itself as each of us, an apparent multiplicity and diversity of objects comes into existence, and at that level there are choices to be made. And we, the apparently separate self or finite mind, is the agent of that choice.
But doesn't that give too much credit for that separate self that doesn't actually exist? So it seems as if it's at two levels in a way, that we seem to be making a concession in a way.
But it doesn't give too much credit to the separate self, because I'm suggesting that the separate self is an activity, not an entity. King Lear is the activity of John Smith. He is not an entity in his own right. So the activity, King Lear, chooses and decides. That is not the fact that the activity, King Lear, chooses and decides, doesn't give the entity, King Lear, any credit. He's not there. There is no entity called King Lear. Likewise, there is no entity called the separate self. The separate self is the finite mind is the activity of infinite consciousness, not an entity in its own right. So the decisions we make are the activity of this finite mind. But there is no actual self, and there's no actual independently existing self that performs those choices or decisions.
I understand.
But nevertheless, there are choices and decisions.
I do understand that. But that seems very random to me. It seems like it does seem like freedom, but it seems like it's a random process, that there's no, because consciousness isn't making a specific choice, and there's no other entity that's making a choice, it feels as if we are in a play and we're just sort of performing.
But King Lear, the activity of King Lear is not random. King Lear never has Julius Caesar's thoughts or Richard III's feelings. He never behaves like Henry V. The activity of King Lear is very specific, although John Smith is complete freedom. He could have all of King Lear, Hamlet, Richard III, Henry V, Coriolanus, Julius Caesar, all those thoughts live in potential in John Smith. But when John Smith assumes the activity of King Lear, his thoughts and feelings become very specific.
And very deterministic, because William Shakespeare,
at that level,
he's
yes.
playing the part, but
Yes.
when he goes into the dressing room, I mean, perhaps there's some spontaneity there, but still that seems random. So either way, it feels either deterministic, in which case there's no free will, because Shakespeare wrote the lines, or he goes into the dressing room, and it's sort of a random thing happening, in which he really doesn't have.
But our
choice.
conversation is not very random, it's coherent. It's our word, your sentence, you're not just plucking words out of anywhere. Your thoughts are extremely coherent. You're expressing yourself clearly. This is not just a free flow of words. It's specific. It's not random.
It doesn't feel random, but that's where I've been going around in circles. When I watch what's happening with our dialogue right now, it doesn't feel like there's anyone doing anything. It's just happening.
There isn't. It's just happening, and your body-mind and my body-mind are the two activities through which it is happening. But if you look for the one who is thinking, the one who is speaking, the one who is listening, you don't find a separate self. You look for that one, all we find is infinite consciousness. So yours and my mind are the activities through which infinite consciousness has divided itself in two for the pleasure, or otherwise, of having this conversation.
One more point. I'm curious in your experience, so when you move your hand, at that moment, do you feel like you're a separate self, but you don't believe it? Do you feel separate at that moment, or do you feel like it's just happening?
No, if I look for a separate self in the field of my experience now, I don't find one. If I scan the field of my current experience, looking for some element of that experience that could legitimately be labeled a separate self, I don't find it. I do find something that could be legitimately be labeled a sensation. If I were to go deeply into that, I would contradict what I've just said and say that even that, at a deeper level, can't even be labeled a sensation. I would say more it was the activity of sensing. And then even that, at a deeper level, I would contradict and say there's not even sensing there, all there is knowing. So at one level, I could point to something that seems to be a separate self. We're not going there at all. I answered your question on the next level, at which I said, no, I can't find anything in the field of my experience which could legitimately be labeled a separate self, but I can find other objects that I might label sensations, perceptions, thoughts. At a deeper level, I would deny that also and say I don't find any discrete objects such as sensations, perceptions and thoughts. I just find thinking, sensing and perceiving, which are subtle objects. And at a deeper level still, I would say actually I can't find any discrete activity in my experience called thinking, sensing and perceiving. It's all a single, intimate, unlimited field of knowing in which there are no parts, no objects, no selves. So it depends on which level, but on the level that you asked me, one down from the conventional level, no, I can't find anything in my experience that could legitimately be called a self.
And when you make choices, do you feel that the choices are just happening through understanding rather than a conscious choice, usually, if you know what I mean?
Somebody asks me if I want tea or coffee for breakfast, I pause, coffee. Was there an entity that somehow manufactured that choice? Was there an entity that selected that choice from two different possibilities? No, there was the question, do you want tea or coffee? Pause, there was the answer, coffee. There was no hearer of the question, there was no thinker of the decision, there was no decider of the choice, there was just the sound, do you want tea or coffee? Pause, coffee.
I think that's important because for me, frequently when I make a decision, afterwards I feel like a separate self made that decision.
That is, as you quoted earlier, Jean Klein actually said that is the separate self who, after this this process in which we hear the question, do you want tea or coffee? We hear the answer, coffee. After that, the thought comes in, I heard, I chose, I decided, I enjoyed, I tasted, etc. But the I is always an afterthought. It is never present in the action itself. And this is why John Klein likened the separate self to the clown that comes on stage after the curtain has fallen to receive the applause. It's a very nice analogy of the separate self.
Thank you.